Dawn in New Guinea is never quiet, but on January 25, 1943, the silence felt unnatural heavy, watchful, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. A thin mist hung over the palms, drifting lazily between the twisted roots and dense undergrowth. The air, thick with humidity, clung to the skin like a second layer of sweat-soaked fabric. At 6:40, a short radio message crackled across the American sector near Sanananda. The voice on the other end was calm, almost indifferent, as if reporting something routine. Patrol Baker-18 has not returned. 5 words, that was all. But those 5 words changed everything. Lieutenant Howard Mansfield, commander of the Emergency Search Detachment, stood over a damp, smudged field map of the Sanananda front. An unforgiving stretch of coast where American and Australian forces had been slugging their way forward through swamps and fortified Japanese positions for months. Mansfield stared at the map as though the message couldn't be real. Baker-18? He repeated aloud, testing the sound of it. They were due back yesterday. 48 hours earlier, 18 American soldiers had stepped off the forward line, disappearing into the green labyrinth west of Sanananda for what should have been a simple reconnaissance suite. A patrol like that usually lasted 10 hours, sometimes 20, rarely more than 24, but now it had been to full days. Mansfield's sergeant, a quiet Wisconsin farmer named Fields, spoke the question no one wanted to say out loud. "Sir, you think they got hit?" Mansfield shook his head slowly. If they were ambushed, we'd hear something. A firefight, a flare, anything, but there had been nothing, no gunfire, no explosions, no radio contact, only silence, a silence so complete it felt unnatural, like the jungle had swallowed the men whole. Within the hour, Mansfield's search team crossed the forward trenches and stepped into the trees. Over their heads, the canopy sealed them in like a living ceiling. The deeper they moved, the darker it became, even though the sun was already rising. The first sign something was wrong came 20 minutes later. A canteen, half buried in mud. American issue. A few yards further, an ammo pouch lying open, not torn, not dropped in a panic, just placed there. And then, the eeriest find of all, a Springfield rifle leaning gently against a tree. Clean, upright, untouched by rust or blood. No footprints, no drag marks, no signs of struggle, just a weapon waiting for a man who would never return. One of the searchers whispered, "Jesus, where the hell did they go?" No one answered, because there was no answer. Not yet. All they knew was that 18 American soldiers walked into this jungle and vanished without a sound. The jungle, Mansfield thought, doesn't kill quietly, not unless it wants to. And as the mist thickened and the shadows deepened around them, it became clear. The search for Baker-18 had begun, but the jungle wasn't going to give them back easily. Before Baker-18 vanished into the green abyss, they were not ghosts, not a legend, not a mystery whispered across the front lines. They were 18 young Americans, ordinary men fighting in extraordinary conditions, on the far edge of the world. And to understand how they disappeared, you must understand who they were. They came from different worlds. The roster of Baker-18, reconstructed from surviving documents and letters, reads like a cross-section of America in 1943. Farm boys from Wisconsin, steel workers from Pittsburgh, a jazz drummer from New Orleans, a quiet Navajo from Arizona, a mechanic from Detroit, a fisherman from Maine. 18 men, 18 stories, and all of them converged in the fetid jungles of New Guinea. Their leader, Sergeant Robert Hale at the head of the patrol, was Sergeant Robert Hale, 27 years old, Tennessee-born, and the others considered steady as bedrock. He had survived the bloody Buna campaign, seen France fall to sniper fire, disease, starvation, and sheer exhaustion. Hale never raised his voice, never showed fear, never asked for anything he couldn't give back. His men trusted him completely. According to records, Hale's last written words scribbled in a damp, mud-stained notebook were simple: "If the jungle wants to test us, let it try." None of the men realized that this test would take them all. The radio man, PFC Milton Annas, if Hale was the backbone of the patrol, Private First Class Milton Annas was its voice. A radio operator from St. Paul, Minnesota, Annas was known for 2 things. 1, he could fix anything with wires. 2, He laughed at jokes before they were finished. He had already come down with dengue fever twice but still refused evacuation, telling the medics, "It's just a Minnesota winter in reverse." When the search team later found his radio headset neatly coiled on a log, Mansfield immediately recognized his signature way of forming loops. That was when the real fear set in, because Anna's never left his radio. Something had convinced him to set it down, something strong enough to override training and survival instinct. The scout, Private Thomas Red Callahan, a red-haired Boston street kid, was the sharpest scout in the platoon. He could detect movement where others saw nothing and read tracks like an open book. A few days before the patrol, he wrote to his younger brother, "The jungle's loud at night, but sometimes it gets quiet. Too quiet, like it's thinking." Those lines would prove hauntingly prophetic. Callahan was the one soldier everyone expected to return alive, but the jungle does not favor the skill. It swallows all men equally. The quiet one, Private Nathan Begay, a Navajo rifleman, soft-spoken and observant. Begay rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. Some men found that unsettling. Hale found it comforting. Begay often moved at the edge of the formation, watching the tree line, listening to the wind shift through the vines, alert to things the others never noticed. An Australian soldier, one of the last to see Baker-18 alive, later said, "The big one, the Indian boy, he kept looking past us, over our shoulders, like he saw something none of us did." Those were the last recorded words describing Nathan Begay. The boy of the group, Private James Harlow, at 19, Harlow was the youngest of the 18. He had lied about his age to enlist and still had the half-grown look of a kid who hadn't finished becoming a man. He carried a photo of his dog in his helmet liner. He asked too many questions. He always volunteered for point duty too eager for his own good. A week before the patrol, he wrote home, "This place feels alive, Ma. It ain't like the woods back home. Here, it watches you." No one knew how right he was. The hard-luck soldier, Corporal Angelo Ricci had survived malaria, a collapsing foxhole, and a Japanese grenade that somehow failed to detonate. His squad mates joked that he was invincible. "Nothing kills Ricci," they said. "That bum'll live forever." They stopped joking after the disappearance. Even invincibility means nothing against New Guinea. A patrol formed from fatigue and bravery. All 18 men had one thing in common. They had been fighting almost non-stop for weeks. Jungle rot, starvation rations, fatigue that made hands tremble when trying to reload, swamps that sucked the boots off your feet, snipers that killed without warning, mosquitoes that carried fevers deadlier than bullets. When command ordered a reconnaissance sweep into the western swamp sector, Baker-18 didn't argue. They were tired, but they were reliable. They had done this before. But this patrol, this one was different. Later, historians would try to explain it. Bad intel, broken compass, disorientation, panic. But the truth was stranger, because the last witnesses who saw Baker-18 alive reported something odd. The men looked exhausted, but they also looked distracted, on edge, as if they sensed something following them, something unseen, something patient, something waiting. And when the patrol marched into the jungle a final time, none of them knew. They were walking toward their own disappearance. New Guinea's jungle was unlike anything American soldiers had seen before. It wasn't simply dense, it was layered, alive, shifting. A living organism that breathed and swallowed and choked everything it touched. When Baker-18 stepped beneath its canopy for the final time, they might as well have stepped off the edge of the known world. The path they followed, if it could be called a path, quickly dissolved into a maze of vines, moss, and ground so soft it felt like rotten sponge. The sunlight vanished behind a wall of leaves, plunging them into a green twilight even though it was barely past noon. Sergeant Hale paused, lifting a hand. "Check spacing. Watch the roots. No zone less necessary." The man nodded, adjusting their grips on their rifles. Sweat already poured down their faces, soaking their bandanas and trickling into their eyes. Mosquitoes swarmed their necks. Leeches clung to their boots. The smell of rot-wet leaves, stagnant water, decomposing vegetation made it hard to breathe. It was not a place built for humans. It was a place designed to break them. The first sign a jungle was changing according to surviving patrol logs from nearby units. Something strange happened that day along multiple sectors. Animals disappeared. No birds, no insects, no rustling mammals. One Australian corporal later recalled, "It was the quiet, the kind that makes the hair on your neck stand up." For Baker-18, the quiet began around midday. Private Harlow whispered to Ricci, "Where are the birds?" Ricci shrugged, "Maybe they're taking the day off." But the joke fell flat. Nobody laughed, because everyone felt it, that suffocating stillness, as if the jungle was aware of their presence, as if it were watching. Pressure from the rear. A few hours in, Hale noticed something troubling. The men kept looking over their shoulders, not constantly, but often enough to break discipline. First Callahan, then Begay, then Annis. Finally Hale stopped the patrol. "All right? What is it? Someone speak." For a moment, no one answered. Then Begay, normally so silent, finally said in a low voice, "Something's behind us." The others stiffened. Callahan nodded. "I heard it too. Branches cracking. Not loud, but heavy, like a man. Or more than one." Annis swallowed hard. "Could be Japs shadowing us." Hale scanned the tree line. He saw nothing. He heard nothing. But deep in his gut, the unease growing since morning sharpened. "All right," he said. "Well, double the rear watch. Stay sharp." The men continued forward, each step slower than the last. The sudden detour at 1500 hours. They reached a shallow creek running dark and sluggish through the forest. This was their planned boundary. After crossing it, they were supposed to turn east and loop back toward American lines. But they didn't. Instead, the patrol veered left-west, deeper into the swamp, against orders, against logic. Historians have argued for decades about what caused the change. Broken compass, high fever, enemy movement, hallucination. But the search team later found Hale's compass. It worked perfectly. Something made them deviate. And whatever it was, did so unanimously, because all 18 sets of footprints followed the same unnatural turn. Ricci reportedly said, "This ain't the way, Sarge." To which Hale supposedly replied, "We're avoiding something." Avoiding what? No one knows. The men never said. They simply crossed the creek and moved westward into terrain known for only two things: men disappearing and never being found. First contact, but not with the enemy. Shortly after the detour, the men found evidence they were not alone. Callahan, scouting ahead, froze mid-step. Behind a cluster of pandanus roots lay a human footprint, barefoot, small, fresh, not Japanese military, not American, not Australian, something or someone local. "You sure it ain't old?" Harlow whispered. Callahan shook his head. "This was made maybe a few hours ago. Whoever it was, they're watching us." Hale studied the print. The toes dug deep, a sign of quick movement, fear, or surprise. He looked into the trees. If someone was there, they didn't show themselves. "Stay together," he ordered, eyes open. The patrol moved on. But now they weren't just being watched. They were being followed, step for step, shadow to shadow. A message they couldn't interpret. Half an hour later, the patrol reached a clearing marked by something incredibly strange. Something later documented by the search team. A line of sticks shoved upright into the mud, perfectly spaced. 17 of them, all pointing toward the west. Callahan stared. Some kind of native warning. Begay shook his head. "Navajo marked danger different," he said slowly. "But this feels like somebody saying not to go there." Hale looked at the sticks a long moment. Then he looked toward the direction they indicated, toward the deeper swamp, toward the unknown. And then, for reasons no one will ever understand, Hale gave a quiet order that sealed their fate. "We continue west." What the search team later found hours after retracing these steps. Mansfield's search party reached the same clearing. They found the stakes. They found the prints. But they also found something Baker-18 never saw. On a tree just beyond the clearing, faint scratches in the bark like fingernails dragging desperately. 5 marks deep. Human. As if someone had tried to warn them. As if someone had tried to escape. Mansfield touched the grooves and felt a chill crawl down his spine. Baker-18 hadn't just wandered into the swamp. They were being driven, and the jungle was closing behind them. As Baker-18 pushed deeper into the swamp, an event occurred that would become the final confirmed sighting of the patrol. A brief encounter with an Australian forward unit stationed near the Killerton track. This moment, lasting less than 5 minutes, became the last time any Allied soldier saw the 18 Americans alive. A sudden appearance out of the trees. It was late afternoon. The Australian platoon, exhausted from days of probing Japanese defenses, had stopped along a narrow trail to boil water and treat their feet jungle rot, was eating half their uni to lie. Private Daniel Shorty Mallory, an Australian scout, later recounted. They came out of the shadows like ghosts. No noise, no warning, just 18 Yanks standing there. The Americans were drenched in sweat and mud. Their uniforms were torn. Some were limping. But what struck the Australians most wasn't their condition. It was their eyes wide, alert, constantly scanning the tree line, as if the jungle itself was stalking them. A conversation that revealed more than intended. Sergeant Hale stepped forward and exchanged quick, polite greetings with the Australian lieutenant. They spoke quietly, privately, 10 yards away from the men. Mallory remembered. The Yank sergeant kept looking behind him, not at us. Behind him, over and over. A second Australian swore. Hale asked a strange question. Did you hear anything following us? But when asked to repeat it, Hale waved it off. Forget it. Long patrol. Men are tired. The Australians offered them water, food, even a chance to rest. Hale refused. We're still on mission, he said. Well, bivouac further west, into the swamp. The Australians were stunned. One of them said, You go west, mate. You're marching into hell. Hale gave a tired nod. Maybe, but hell's where our job is today. The men looked different to Australians who spoke with members of Baker-18. Noticed something odd. Private Harlow, normally talkative, said almost nothing. Just stared into the trees. Callahan kept his hand on his rifle the whole time. Not relaxed, not casual. Ready. Begay barely blinked. He seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. And Ricci, the invincible one, looked pale and shaken, like someone had whispered something terrible to him. Mallory later recalled. It was like they were seeing something we weren't. Like they were hearing something we couldn't. A cryptic warning as the Americans prepared to leave. The Australian lieutenant asked Hale, You sure you don't need escort? This area's gone quiet. To quiet. Hale hesitated just for a second. Then he said something that stuck with the Australians for the rest of their lives. We're being shadowed. If it's the Japanese, they're damn patient. If it's not, then I don't know what it is. It was the only recorded hint that Baker-18 believed something was following them. Something unseen. Something silent. The departure into oblivion. The Australians watched as the Americans formed their column and stepped back into the swamp. No one waved. No one smiled. The Australians stood silently until the last helmet vanished behind the vines. Mallory said, Then the forest swallowed them. Just like that. Like they'd never been there. 10 minutes later, the jungle sounds returned. Birds, insects, distant rustles, everything that had fallen silent while Baker-18 approached. The Australians didn't know what that meant at the time. Later, they would realize. Nature itself had gone quiet for those men, and nature was warning them. The last known moment at 1742 hours, the shadows lengthening across the swamp. An Australian sentry thought he heard distant voices, the Americans maybe calling to each other. But then the voices stopped abruptly, and darkness fell. That was the last trace of Baker-18. From that moment on, they simply ceased to exist. They were 18 men alive at sunset. By sunrise the next morning, they were already ghosts. When Baker-18 vanished from Australian sight and marched west into the swamp, they crossed an invisible threshold, a line every veteran, every scout, and every local villager knew not to cross. Beyond that boundary lay a part of New Guinea where maps meant nothing, compasses spun uselessly, and even the Japanese rarely patrol. It was called many things. The dead swamp, the black water, the breathing mud, the wet death. It was not a battlefield. It was a predator, and Baker-18 walked straight into its jaws. The ground that eats soldiers as the sun fell. The first signs of danger appeared beneath their boots. What looked like firm soil was actually decaying vegetation suspended above deep pits of black, oxygen-starved water. The surface bowed with every step, groaning like stretched leather. Harlow tested a patch with his rifle butt. The ground burst open like rotten skin. A foul, bubbling hole gurgled beneath. Christ, he whispered. This place ain't right. The swamp didn't need bullets to kill men. It needed gravity. A single misstep, a shift of weight, a root giving way, and a soldier could vanish silently beneath the surface, dragged down by 50 pounds of gear and mud that behaved like liquid cement. Even Japanese diaries recovered after the war warned. warn, do not enter the black ground. It takes men without sound. But Baker-18 had already entered. The night storm as darkness fell, a storm rolled in sudden, violent, biblical. Rain hammered the canopy, turning the swamp into a rising soup of mud and debris. Rivers overflowed, trails dissolved, roots became slick, deadly ropes. Hail shouted over the thunder, "Keep moving. If we stop, we freeze or sink." Lightning flashed, revealing haunting silhouettes of twisted trees and flooded earth. Branches snapped. Waves of water surged through the underbrush, smashing into the men's legs. Ricci slipped first. He dropped through a pocket of swamp with a scream, swallowed to the waist in black muck. Callahan and Begay grabbed him, pulling him free as the mud tried to claim him piece by piece. When he emerged, gasping, his boots were gone. The swamp had taken them, and it wanted more. The invisible enemy. Disease. The storm soaked every man to the skin, and with the water came sickness. New Guinea was the deadliest environment of the entire Pacific War, not because of the Japanese, but because of the diseases. Malaria, dysentery, dengue, filariasis, tropical ulcers, typhus, mosquitoes swarmed the men in clouds, feeding on exposed skin. Ricci developed a trembling fever within an hour. Harlow vomited twice. Anna's wiped blood from a nosebleed that wouldn't stop. They were decaying faster than the jungle around them. Something was following them. By midnight, Callahan heard it again. A crack, a shift of weight, a rhythm that didn't belong to animals. He whispered to Hale, "That's not a Jap scout. They don't move like that. This is heavier. Closer." Hale said nothing, because he heard it too. Something was moving just beyond the edge of vision. Never visible, always present. At one point, Harlow swore he saw a shadow between the trees, tall, human-shaped, and moving. When lightning lit up the swamp, the figure vanished. Begay murmured quietly, "Something here doesn't want us." And the storm continued, drenching the patrol as they stumbled deeper into the maze-like wetlands, their sense of direction breaking apart with every step. The trees that whispered near dawn, the storm faded to a soft drizzle. Fog rose from the ground to curling around their legs. The world became a gray dream where nothing stayed still. And then they heard it. Whispers, faint, distant, moving with the mist. At first they thought it was the wind. Then they realized the jungle was perfectly still. Callahan gripped his rifle so hard his knuckles whitened. "You hear that, Sarge?" Hale nodded, and as shook uncontrollably. Feverish. "It sounds like someone calling," he whispered, "like men, far away." But when the patrol shouted back, the voices went silent. For the first time, Hale allowed fear into his voice. "This place is playing tricks. Keep walking." But the whispers continued, following them, surrounding them. Never closer, never farther, just there. The last recorded message, sometime near sunrise, Anna's tried to radio command. The message was simple. "This is Baker, Patrol lost, swamp request static." Then silence. That short burst, barely audible, half drowned in interference, was the last transmission ever received from Baker-18. The radio never spoke again. A final sign of collapse hours later, when Mansfield's search team eventually retraced these steps. They found one final clue from the swamp stage, a torn field jacket draped over a log. Inside the pocket was a scrap of paper, blurred by water. "We are not alone. Something moving, cannot see it." No signature, but the handwriting matched Anna's. It was the last written words of anyone in Baker-18. By morning, the swamp had begun its final act, and the men of Baker-18 had already crossed beyond the boundaries of the living. By the time Baker-18 failed to arrive at their rendezvous point, headquarters dismissed it as a simple delay. Everyone got lost in New Guinea at some point. Everyone ran late. Patrols were lucky just to get back alive at all. But when 12 hours passed, then 18, then a full day, Mansfield, the battalion intelligence officer, knew something was wrong. He had read enough field reports, logged enough missing patrols, and buried enough men to see the signs. Men late were common. Men silent were not. And Baker-18 had gone very, very silent. The first search teams, the initial search was small for Australians and 2 American scouts, retracing Baker-18's known route. They didn't get far. The storm had erased every track, every boot print, every sign the patrol had had ever existed. Even the spot where Australians last saw them had returned to its original state. Vines curling back over the churned earth, the jungle was already reclaiming the men. After hours of hacking through vines and sinking into muck, the team turned back exhausted, bringing only one message. They didn't head south or east. Whatever happened, it happened west, into the swamp, exactly where no one wanted to go. Theories begin at headquarters, theories formed as officers huddled over maps stained with coffee, sweat, and mildew. Theory 1. Japanese ambush. The simplest explanation. The Japanese might have cut them down quickly, buried the bodies, taken equipment, but scouts reported no fresh Japanese tracks, no casings, no bodies, no disturbances. And Baker-18 was armed, experienced, and wary. 18 trained Americans didn't just fall in minutes without firing a shot. There were no signs of a firefight, none. Theory 2. Swamp entrapment. The swamp could kill silently. Men could drown in 3 feet of mud. Bodies might never surface. This theory was possible, probable, even, but it didn't explain everything. 18 men would leave something behind. Boot prints, gear, clothing, a rifle, a helmet, but there was nothing, not a trace, as if they moved perfectly or were carried. Theory 3. Mass capture. Some officers insisted the Japanese had taken all 18 Americans alive, but captured patrols fought, yelled, left blood or broken foliage. Baker-18 left nothing, and Japanese records examined after the war contained no mention of such a capture. It was the most unlikely theory, which left the final one. Theory 4. Something else. It was never written in official reports, never said aloud in formal meetings, but among scouts, stretcher-bearers, and the Papuan carriers who knew the land better than any Westerner. Whispers circulated. Something in the swamp, something older than the war, something locals refused to name. One Papuan guide summed it up simply: if they go west, the forest closes. A strange report from a Japanese diary 2 days into the search. A lone Japanese soldier was captured near Garua, had been separated from his unit, delirious with fever, mumbling in a mix of Japanese and broken English. One sentence kept repeating: Americans, 18, walking with ghosts. At first, no one took him seriously. Then the intelligence officer reading his diary froze. Inside, in neat handwriting, was a chilling note. Saw foreign soldiers far in swamp, moving in single file, very quiet, not look human. The date matched the day Baker-18 was last seen. The description didn't. Hale's men were dirty, tired, and sick, but they were still men. Yet the Japanese observer had written, not look human. The report was classified immediately. When locals refused to go on, Australian officers requested Papuan guides. For the next stage of the search, most refused instantly, shaking their heads without explanation. One elder said, "This place is hungry. Once it takes men, it keeps them." Another guy, normally fearless, trembled visibly. "The dead walk there. Not our dead. Not your dead. Different dead." He never clarified, but he insisted, "You're 18, they already belong to the swamp." A whisper from the radio corps 3 days after Baker-18 vanished. An American radio man reported hearing a faint transmission during the night watch. A voice, male. "We." The words were unclear, warped by distance and interference. Some heard, "Help west," others swore it sounded more like, "Don't follow," or even more disturbing. Not alone. The signal lasted 15 seconds. Then it vanished. The radio man checked the logs. The frequency belonged to Baker-18's set, but their radio had been silent for days. The pattern of disappearances. When Mansfield dug through older Papuan constabulary logs, he found references that shook him. This wasn't the first patrol to vanish west of Sanananda. It was the 7th. Australian patrol, 1941 to 6 men gone. Local militia group -11 men gone. Japanese reconnaissance squad -10 men gone, no bodies found. Another Australian unit to 4 men, all missing. Civilian labor team -9 porters disappeared, supplies untouched. Not one body ever recovered. The swamp, it seemed, had a specific appetite. Small groups, moving single file, heading west, and now 18 Americans had joined the list. Theories darkened as the search dragged on. Men whispered darker suspicions. Maybe they were hunted. Maybe something drove them deeper. Maybe something herded them. The jungle was vast, endless, unmapped, and something inside it had taken Baker-18 with complete, terrible silence. Mansfield's conclusion after days poring over maps, reports, and witness accounts. Mansfield wrote a quiet, private line in his notebook never meant for official record. Whatever happened to Baker-18, it was not human hands alone. Baker-18 were no longer missing soldiers. They were now part of a mystery the war itself couldn't explain, and the search teams were about to step into the same darkness. By the fourth day, the disappearance of Baker-18 was no longer a routine delay. It had become a full-scale crisis. The chain of command could no longer ignore it. Search orders were issued, supplies gathered, and a mixed American-Australian rescue team was assembled, but the Papuan guides refused, one after another, to accompany them into the western swamp. Not for money, not for rank, not even at gunpoint. It wasn't fear of war. It was fear of something older. One guide summed it up simply. You are entering the place where the living should not walk. No amount of pleading changed their minds. The search team, the final group that set out, consisted of Lt. Russell Mansfield, Intelligence Corporal Henry Clark, tracker to Australian engineers, 3 American riflemen for Papuan carriers, the only ones willing to guide them, and even they refused to go beyond a certain point. 9 men total. They moved out at dawn, stepping into a jungle that felt colder, darker, and more oppressive than anywhere else along the front. The air grew still. Birds fell silent. Insects went quiet. Feels like walking into a dead man's breath, Clark whispered. He wasn't wrong. The border of the forbidden zone, roughly 4 hours into the march, the carriers stopped abruptly. No argument, no hesitation. They set their packs down and refused to go farther. Mansfield asked why. One of the carriers pointed ahead toward a curtain of black vines and twisted trees. This is where shadows walk, he said. We do not cross. When Mansfield pressed him, the carrier said something even stranger. Your men crossed here. But they were not alone. Another added, if you hear calling, do not answer. With that, they turned back, leaving the remaining soldiers to press forward into the unknown. The sudden change in the air once the search team stepped past that invisible line. The environment shifted in ways they couldn't fully explain. The light dimmed unnaturally. Humidity thickened until every breath felt like it was drawn through wet cloth. Moss hung from branches like decaying flesh. And worst of all, there were no animal sounds, none. Where are the birds? One rifleman asked. Clark wiped sweat from his brow. There are places in the world, he said, where nature stops talking. Signs of Baker-18 after 3 hours in the silent zone. The team found their first sign that Baker-18 had passed through. A broken vine. A scrap of cloth olive drab UDS. A shoe. A footprint in a patch of firmer ground. All pointed forward, deeper into the swamp. But the strangest clue lay a few yards farther. A canteen wedged in the crook of a tree, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. Mansfield picked it up. The metal was ice cold, far colder than the surrounding air. One Australian muttered, "Why would they put this here?" No one answered, because no one knew if a man had put it there, or something else. The voices near afternoon, the team stopped to rest. That was when they heard it. A faint voice, calling from the west. Help, soft, weak, far away. Then again, help. The Americans jumped to attention. Mansfield raised a hand, listening intently. Clark shook his head. That ain't one of ours. How can you tell? Because it's the same tone, same pitch, same breath, repeating, exactly the same. The voice didn't sound like a man calling. It sounded like a man being played back. One of the Australians whispered, "That's not a voice. That's an echo pretending to be one." The men shivered despite the heat. The camp that shouldn't exist. As dusk approached, they stumbled onto a clearing unnatural in shape. Perfectly circular, with its center churned to mud. Something had camped here recently, but no fires had been lit. No footprints remained, only shapes in the mud suggesting heavy weights too large for human boots. Clark crouched, touching the ground. This wasn't made by 18 men, he said quietly. Mansfield knelt beside him. Animals? Clark shook his head. No animal moves like this. The search team exchanged uneasy glances. The disappearing trees as they prepared to leave the clearing. clearing. Mansfield noticed something unnerving in the tree line. A large tree, a massive, twisted trunk draped in moss, seemed closer than it had been minutes earlier. He stared at it for a long time. Then it happened again. Not visibly, not with motion, just suddenly there. Closer. Impossible. One of the Australians breathed. Did that tree just move? No one responded, because no one wanted to admit what they saw. Nightfall, the search team made camp reluctantly, too exhausted to push forward in darkness. They built a small perimeter, weapons ready, and during the night, every man heard something. Sometimes whispers, sometimes footsteps, sometimes the muffled splash of something heavy moving through water. At one point, an American private shot at a shape in the dark. The bullet echoed. The jungle swallowed the sound, but nothing fled, nothing cried out, nothing reacted. Mansfield later wrote in his private notes, "The jungle was listening to us, studying us, learning us." Dawn, when the sun rose, the search team found three strange things. 1. Their perimeter markers had been moved, shifted several feet inside the line without a sound. 2. CLARKES pack was open, items rearranged, not stolen. 3. Deep impressions in the mud, resembling footprints but far too long, too narrow, as if something tall had stood watching them. The Australians wanted to turn back, but Mansfield refused. "We go until we find something," he said, "or until we become the next missing patrol." He didn't realize how close they already were, because ahead of them, shrouded by vines and fog, lay the place where Baker-18's trail ended. The final clue, the final horror, and the edge of a mystery that had claimed men for generations. By the 7th day of Baker-18's disappearance, the search team stepped into a part of the swamp where the air itself seemed heavier, as if they were wading through invisible water. Every movement felt slowed, muffled, resisted. Even breathing felt restrained, like the jungle was pushing back. Corporal Clark whispered what everyone else was thinking. "We're not supposed to be here," but they pressed forward, because somewhere ahead lay the last trace of the 18 missing Americans, and they were about to find it. The first horrifying discovery, the trail narrowed and descended into a shallow basin flooded with a sheen of black water. Vines hung overhead like ropes in an execution yard. Mansfield froze. There, half submerged in the mud, lay UWII M1 helmet. A single bullet hole pierced the crown, but there was no skull beneath it. The inside was clean, empty, pristine. Clark picked it up, examining the metal. "It hasn't been here long," he said. "Maybe hours, maybe a day." The search team's formation tightened instinctively. Someone whispered, "Where's the man who wore it?" No one answered, because the mud around the helmet held no footprints, no tracks, no drag marks, as if the soldier simply ceased to exist. The strange clearing. After another half-hour push, the team entered a clearing unlike any they had seen in the jungle, perfectly round, 20 yards across. The trees forming its border were bent outward, not cut, not broken, but bent, as if forced back by tremendous pressure. In the center of the clearing, a tree stump, carved, with marks no one could identify. The cuts spiraled down the surface in geometric patterns. Some were deep, some shallow, all impossibly precise. They weren't tool marks, they weren't scratches, they were deliberate. One Australian touched the grooves. His hand recoiled instantly. "Cold," he said. "It's cold, like metal." In the tropical heat of New Guinea, nothing was cold, nothing natural. The torn journal page just beyond the stump, half lodged in a twisted root. Clark spotted paper, drenched, fragile, but mostly legible. A journal page, American issue, standard ration book size, and his handwriting. "The same man who sent the final radio message." Mansfield read aloud. "We lost another man, not to bullets, not to drowning." He stepped into the trees and he was gone. No cry, no struggle, no trace. Below it, one final line. "We are being separated." The page ended abruptly, torn. One of the Australians whispered, "Jesus Christ," another asked the only question on everyone's mind. How did 18 trained soldiers get separated in a single-file column without anyone noticing? No one answered, because there was no human explanation. The second discovery, the rope near the southern edge of the clearing. Mansfield found a length of rope, U.S. airborne issue, the kind paratroopers carried for scaling slopes. But something was wrong. The rope hadn't snapped. It hadn't been cut. It had been pulled apart. The fibers splayed outward, frayed down to needles. Clark stared in disbelief. I've never seen a rope torn like that. Not by hands. Not even by animals. The forces required would have been enormous. Or unnatural. The final trail at the far edge of the clearing lay the largest clue yet. Footprints. American boots. Large. Small. 18 distinct tracks. Finally, a trail. The man exhaled with relief, but that relief lasted only seconds, because the footprints didn't lead away. They led in a perfect circle around the clearing, over and over. 13 layers, 14, 15, as if the man had marched endlessly around the stump, around the symbols, around something they could not understand, walking in circles until... What? They collapsed? They were taken? They walked themselves out of existence. Clark stepped back. No, they wouldn't march like that. Not unless they were forced. Mansfield knelt beside the tracks. They weren't marching, he said, his voice quiet, trembling. They were following something. Where the tracks and the circular pattern of footprints ended abruptly on the western side of the clearing. No fading prints. No scattered trails. No signs of retreat. Just nothing. As if all 18 men had taken a final step and vanished mid-stride. Clark crouched for a long time, studying the ground. Finally, he said, "There's no collapse pattern. They didn't fall. They didn't sink. They didn't run." He swallowed. They just stopped existing. An Australian stepped backward, rifle trembling. "This place isn't right, Lieutenant. We need to leave now." For the first time, Mansfield didn't argue. He stood slowly, eyes scanning the trees, because something was watching them. Every man felt it. A pressure, a presence, a silent intelligence moving just out of sight. The same thing that had followed Baker-18. The same thing that might now be following them. The decision to retreat. Mansfield ordered the retreat immediately. No more searching. No more pushing forward. Whatever happened to Baker-18 was beyond the reach of the living. And if they stayed another hour, the swamp might claim them too. The search team moved quickly, quietly, weapons up, eyes forward. But as they left the clearing, Clark whispered the words every man had already thought. It wasn't the Japanese. And as they marched back through the trees, something moved behind them. Not loud, not fast, just present, following, waiting, like it had before. The moment Mansfield gave the order to pull back, the entire search team felt a shift, a silent, heavy pressure easing slightly, as though whatever had been observing them was now content to let them go. For the moment, they moved quickly through the swamp, boots sucking into the mud, vines clawing at their uniforms. Every man felt the same unspoken truth. They were no longer searching for Baker-18. They were escaping the fate that took them. The forest begins to follow. 10 minutes into the retreat, Clark stopped abruptly. Listen. The men froze. Behind them, something huge shifted through the underbrush. Slow, measured, deliberate, not running, not stalking, simply matching their pace. A step for every step, a pause for every pause. One of the Australians whispered, "It's escorting us out." Another replied, "No, it's making sure we leave." The presence never grew closer, but never fell behind. It stayed exactly at the edge of hearing, exactly where Baker-18 first sensed it. The path is gone as the team navigated toward the landmark where the Papuans had turned back. Mansfield realized something terrifying. The path they had cut on the way in was healing behind them. Vines looped back down. Leaves folded over broken branches. Mud-filled shallow footprints. Within minutes, the jungle looked untouched, as if trying to erase the team's existence the same way it erased Baker-18. Clark muttered, "This place doesn't want history. It doesn't want witnesses." The whispers returned as they crossed a shallow patch of water. The whispers returned, faint and distant, drifting between trees. But this time they weren't calling help. They were calling the names of the search team. First softly, Clark then louder, Mansfield then a chorus. A dozen voices, overlapping in different tones. "Turn back, come west, stay." The team broke into a near run. One rifleman, trembling violently, muttered, "That's not them. That's not their voices." Clark answered, "I know." The scent of death as they continued. A foul smell drifted across their path. Heavy, rotten, not animal, not human. It seeped through their clothes, clung to their skin, made breathing painful. The Australians gagged. Mansfield covered his mouth. Clark whispered, "I smelled this once before." After a flood, when they found bodies trapped under the mud, everyone's pace quickened, because the smell was getting stronger. Coming from behind, the presence gets closer for the first time. Whatever was following them stepped closer. Branches bent, leaves shook, water rippled, but still, no shape, no form, just an overwhelming sensation of something tall moving just beyond sight, matching their path step for step. The youngest rifleman spun and fired a burst into the tree line. The echo rolled across the swamp, but nothing moved, nothing cried out, nothing ran. Clark grabbed the young man's arm. "Don't shoot again. If it wanted us dead, we'd be dead." Panic in the ranks, fatigue, hunger, and terror worked together like poison. One Australian broke. He bolted forward, pushing through vines, shouting, "Get me out of here, and not dying in this cursed place." He disappeared behind a wall of trees. Mansfield cursed and sprinted after him. Clark and the others followed. They found the Australian seconds later, standing perfectly still, not moving, not responding, eyes open wide, body rigid, as if something enormous had passed directly in front of him silently. Clark shook him. The soldier blinked, gasped, and collapsed into the mud. He couldn't remember what happened. He didn't want to. They carried him for the next mile, the line they should not cross. When the team finally reached the invisible boundary, where the Papuan guides had stopped, the air suddenly changed. Warmth returned. Humidity eased. Birds began singing again, as if the jungle was releasing its grip. Behind them, the presence stopped. No footsteps, no whispers, no movement, just silence. Mansfield stared into the tree line. He felt it watching, not with eyes, but with the land itself. The guide's reaction when the search team finally reached the carriers. The Papuans looked at them with a mix of sorrow and fear. One guide approached Mansfield. "You went where men do not go." Mansfield nodded slowly. "You're 18, they did not come back," the guide continued. Another guide added in a whisper, "They did not die. The swamp keeps them." The final glimpse as the team prepared to leave the jungle for goat, Clark turned back for one last look. For a split second, only a second, he saw a tall silhouette standing between the trees. Too tall, too narrow, too still. The shape dissolved into the foliage. Clark didn't tell the others. He didn't need to. They all felt it. Whatever took Baker-18 had watched them leave and allowed them to live, but only because they were not meant to join the 18 lost souls. The retreat from the western swamp marked the last moment any Allied soldier willingly crossed into the forbidden zone. The search ended not because the army stopped caring, but because every man who returned carried the same haunted expression. "We were not meant to find them." Word spread quietly, whispered through foxholes and mess tents. Nobody said it aloud in official briefings. No report recorded it. But among soldiers, engineers, porters, and scouts, the belief was the same. Baker-18 wasn't missing. They were claimed. The official explanation headquarters released a simple conclusion. Baker-18 perished in the swamps of Sanananda. Bodies unrecovered due to terrain and enemy presence. A neat sentence, sanitized, safe. Families received form letters. Next of kin received medals wrapped in wax paper. New replacements filled the empty roster lines. But the search team knew the truth behind that tidy summary. There were no battle signs, no gear, no bodies, no remains. The 18 men didn't die in combat. They disappeared, as if erased. Mansfield's private notes after returning to base. Lieutenant Russell Mansfield wrote a private memorandum, not for command, but for himself. It was found decades later among his effects. One line, underlined twice, read, "We were being watched. By what? I cannot say, but they've followed us until we crossed the line where the living belong." And later, if Baker-18 crossed willingly, they were led. If unwillingly, they were taken. He never elaborated, but his final note was the most chilling. "The swamp is not empty. It chooses." Clark's silence. Corporal Henry Clark, the best tracker in 3 divisions, never spoke publicly about the mission. Not once, but weeks later, during a supply run, he told an Australian corporal, "I've tracked men for 15 years. I've tracked animals my whole life, but what I followed out there was tracking us. He left Papua shortly after. He never returned. The Australians report the Australian engineers filed a brief statement. Did not locate patrol. Region unsafe. Recommend area be classified as off-limits. But the unspoken story, the real one, circulated among veterans. The engineers claimed they heard footsteps pacing around their camp at night. Footsteps too heavy, too slow, to deliberate. One said, whatever it was, it knew the land better than any man. Another added, it wasn't hunting, it was guarding something. What the Papuans said, the Papuan carriers, who lived in and understood the jungle better than any foreign soldier, refused to return to that region again. When asked what they believed happened, the eldest simply said, the swamp has spirits older than your empires. Sometimes they walk, sometimes they take. Another added, your 18 men stepped into the shadows. The shadows closed. To them, the explanation was simple. New Guinea's forests were alive, powerful, and unforgiving to outsiders. To the soldiers, it was something else entirely. The war moves on the campaign pushed forward. Men fought, men fell. The front shifted north, deeper into Japanese territory. But some stories never fade. Every time a patrol went missing, every time strange lights flickered in the canopy, or footsteps echoed without a source, someone whispered, Baker-18. Some said the lost patrol still wandered the swamp, trapped between worlds, marching in endless circles around a carved stump. Others believed they were taken by Japanese special units, and some believed the simplest explanation was the most terrifying. The jungle killed them, not with teeth or bullets, but by swallowing them whole. Final mystery. Years after the war, in 1954, an Australian explorer attempted to cross the same western region. He returned pale and shaken, claiming he found a scrap of American webbing tangled in a vine. He refused to go back. He said the ground felt wrong, as if it breathed, and when he camped near the old clearing, he heard footsteps circling him at night, slow, measured, human. He wrote in his log, I am not alone here. Someone is walking the perimeter. 18 steps, always 18. He left New Guinea the next week. What truly happened to Baker-18? 18 trained American soldiers entered the swamp. Not one came out. Not one body was found. Not one weapon. Not one scrap of fabric. Only a helmet, a torn journal page, a rope ripped apart, footprints that led in circles and then vanished. Theories remain. Japanese captured drowning, disease, exhaustion, panic, jungle disorientation. But none explain the lack of bodies. None explain the missing gear. None explain the strange carvings, or the whispers, or the shadow. None explain why something followed the search team back and then stopped at the same place. Baker-18 crossed. Whatever happened out there, it was not a battle. It was a disappearance. A clean, total, silent vanishing. Something in the swamp took them, or welcomed them, or consumed them. We will never know. And the swamp of Sanananda keeps its secrets. Final line. 18 men walked into the jungle. 18 shadows walked with them, and the shadows came back alone.